The security camera footage was crystal clear. Margaret Whitmore, president of the Oakwood Hills HOA, screaming as she stumbled out of Jake Morrison's pool at 2:47 a.m., her designer nightgown smoking from the scalding water. What she didn't know was that Jake had been waiting for this moment for 3 months, ever since he'd installed the swimming pool heater malfunction that only activated when someone broke in after midnight. Now, Margaret was suing him for $2.80 million, claiming permanent disfigurement. Jake had evidence that would destroy her perfect reputation and expose the twisted lengths she'd gone to make his life hell. The only question was, who Jake Morrison had always believed that moving to Oakwood Hills would be the fresh start his family desperately needed. The gated community promised serenity, safety, and the kind of neighbors who waved from perfectly manicured lawns. What he hadn't counted on was Margaret Whitmore. "Excuse me, Mr. Morrison." Her voice cut through the September morning air like a blade wrapped in silk. Jake looked up from where he was installing the final tile around his new pool, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. Margaret stood at his property line, clipboard in hand, her silver hair styled in what Jake had come to think of as the "I'd like to speak to your manager" cut. "Mrs. Whitmore." Jake straightened, wiping his hands on his work shirt. At 42, he'd dealt with enough difficult clients in his construction business to recognize trouble when it came calling. "What can I do for you?" Margaret's pale blue eyes swept over his backyard with the precision of a military inspection. "I've been reviewing the HOA guidelines regarding pool installations, and I'm afraid there are several violations that need immediate attention." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "I submitted the plans 3 months ago. They were approved by the architectural committee. That was before I assumed my position as HOA president." Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm afraid the previous administration was rather lax in their oversight. The setback from your rear property line is 3 inches short of the required 15 feet. 3 inches? Jake couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. "You're talking about 3 inches? Rules are rules, Mr. Morrison. If we allow one exception, where does it end?" Margaret made a note on her clipboard with theatrical precision. "I'll need you to either relocate the entire pool or face daily fines of $500 until the violation is corrected." Jake stared at her, certain he'd misheard. $500 a day. The fines are clearly outlined in Section 4.2.1 of your homeowners agreement. Margaret's tone suggested she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Which you did sign, didn't you?" Behind her, Jake noticed movement in the upstairs window of the Whitmore house. A man's face appeared briefly. Margaret's husband, Charles, before disappearing like a ghost. In the 6 months since Jake had moved in, he'd seen Charles Whitmore maybe a dozen times, always hurrying to his car or rushing inside as if afraid of being caught outdoors. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice level. "I've got $40,000 invested in this pool. My daughter Emma has been looking forward to swimming in it since we moved here. Surely we can work something out." "Understand this is inconvenient," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested she understood nothing of the sort. "But rules exist for a reason. Property values, aesthetic standards, community harmony. Surely you can appreciate these concerns." Jake glanced toward his house, where Emma's face was pressed against the kitchen window. At 16, she'd struggled with a move from their old neighborhood, leaving behind friends and familiar places. The pool had been his promise to her that this new life would be better, different, worth the sacrifice. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Margaret's smile widened. "Complete removal and reconstruction in compliance with HOA guidelines. I've taken the liberty of getting quotes from approved contractors." She handed him a business card. "Whitmore Construction offers very competitive rates for HOA-compliant installations." Jake stared at the card, the pieces clicking into place. "Whitmore Construction. That wouldn't happen to be my son's company." "Yes, Trevor does excellent work, very detail-oriented when it comes to following regulations." The audacity of it hit Jake like a physical blow. She was manufactured a violation to force him into using her son's construction company, a scheme that would net the Whitmore thousands while destroying his family's summer plans. "This is extortion," Jake said quietly. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "I beg your pardon, you heard me. You're making up violations to force me to hire your son. Mr. Morrison, I would be very Careful about making accusations you can't prove. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Especially when you're already in violation of multiple HOA regulations. Pool placement, unapproved exterior lighting, and let's see, she flipped through her clipboard. Oh yes, your garbage cans were visible from the street last Tuesday. That's another $500 fine. Jake felt heat rise in his chest. My garbage cans? Waste receptacles must be completely concealed from public view, except during designated collection hours. Yours were visible for approximately 6 minutes after the truck departed. Margaret made another note. I have photographs. You've got to be kidding me. I never kid about community standards, Mr. Morrison now. Regarding the pool situation, I'll need your decision by Friday. Remove it, relocate it, or face the daily fines. Margaret turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and there's a community meeting this Thursday evening, 7 o'clock sharp. I do hope you'll attend. We'll be discussing several new initiatives to enhance our neighborhood's quality of life. Jake watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with military precision. Only when she'd disappeared into her house did he notice his hands were shaking with rage. Dad Emma had emerged from the house, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the bathing suit she'd bought specifically for their new pool. What did Mrs. Whitmore want? Jake looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Emma had inherited her mother's delicate features and quiet strength, but also Sarah's tendency to internalize stress. Since Sarah's death in the car accident 2 years ago, Emma had become Jake's entire world. The move to Oakwood Hills was supposed to give them both a chance to heal, to build something new from the wreckage of their old life. Just some HOA stuff. Sweetheart, nothing for you to worry about. But Emma wasn't fooled. At 16, she'd grown adept at reading the stress lines around her father's eyes. She's trying to make us get rid of the pool, isn't she? Jake considered lying, then decided his daughter deserved better. She's claiming it violates some regulation, says it's 3 inches too close to the back fence. 3 inches. Emma's voice rose. That's insane. That's what I said. Emma walked to the edge of the pool, her reflection wavering in the clear water. Jake had spent weeks getting the chemistry perfect, the tiles aligned, the lighting system installed. It was more than just a pool. It was a symbol of their new beginning, a place where Emma could bring friends, where they could host barbecues and maybe, eventually, feel like they belonged somewhere again. What are we going to do? Emma asked. Jake joined her at the pool's edge, studying the 3-inch gap between the concrete and the rear fence. In his 20 years as a contractor, he'd seen plenty of corrupt officials and manufactured violations, but never anything this blatant. We're going to fight it, he said finally. Emma looked at him with something approaching relief. Really? Really? Margaret Whitmore thinks she can push us around because we're new here. She's about to learn otherwise. That evening, Jake spent hours poring over the HOA documentation, looking for loopholes or contradictions in Margaret's claims. The original architectural approval was crystal clear. The pool met all stated requirements, but buried in the fine print of his homeowner's agreement, he found the clause Margaret was using. The HOA board reserves the right to modify regulations as needed to maintain community standards. It was a catch-all provision that essentially gave the board unlimited power to make up rules as they went along. Jake had seen similar language in other HOA agreements, but never enforced so aggressively. His phone rang just after 11 p.m. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Mr. Morrison. This is Charles Whitmore, Margaret's husband. Jake straightened in his chair. Charles's voice was barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard. What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore? I wanted to apologize for my wife's behavior today, the pool situation. It's not right what she's doing. Then why don't you stop her? A long pause. You don't understand, Margaret. She's not well. This obsession with the HOA, with controlling everything, it's gotten worse over the years. Not well, how? She sees threats everywhere. Neighbors who don't follow her rules, property values declining, the community falling apart. She genuinely believes she's protecting us all from chaos. Charles's voice dropped even further. Last year, she had the Johnsons fined into bankruptcy over their rose garden. They lost their house. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Over a rose garden, unapproved. Plantings, she claimed, daily fines, just like with your Part 2, Escalating, The first sign that Margaret Whitmore had declared total war came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, when Jake's security system blared to life. He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering as the motion sensors tracked movement. In his backyard, by the time he grabbed his robe and made it to the sliding glass door, whoever had triggered the alarm was gone. Dad Emma appeared in the hallway, hair tousled from sleep. "What's happening?" "Probably just a raccoon," Jake lied, though the footprints were clearly human. Size 7 shoes, he estimated. With a distinctive tread pattern, he made a mental note to remember. The next morning, Jake found a citation taped to his front door. Violation notice. Excessive noise disturbance during community quiet hours, 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Fine, $750. Jake stared at the paper in disbelief. His security alarm had sounded for less than 30 seconds before he'd shut it off. But there was Margaret's precise handwriting documenting the exact time and duration of the disturbance, complete with a reference to HOA Regulation 7.3.2 regarding electronic devices that disturb community peace. "She was here," Jake said aloud, the realization hitting him like ice water. Margaret had been in his backyard in the middle of the night, deliberately triggering his security system. To the pool, immediately noticing something was off. The water, which had been crystal clear the night before, now had a slight green tint. He tested the chlorine levels and found them dangerously low. One had dumped a neutralizing agent into the water, probably something as simple as hydrogen peroxide or vitamin C tablets. The Sabotage was subtle enough to look like negligent maintenance, but Jake knew better. Margaret was escalating, moving from manufactured violations to outright vandalism. At work that morning, Jake tried to focus on his current project, a custom kitchen renovation for a client in the next town. But his mind kept drifting to Margaret's midnight visit. The woman was clearly unhinged, but how far would she go? And more importantly, how could he protect Emma from whatever came next? His phone rang just before lunch. The caller ID showed Emma's school. "Mr. Morrison, this is Principal Davidson, Oakwood Hills High. I need you to come in immediately." "What kind of incident? Is she hurt?" "She's fine physically, but there are some serious allegations that need to be addressed." In person, the drive to Emma's school felt like the longest 15 minutes of Jake's life. He found Emma sitting in the principal's office, her face red and blotchy from crying. Across from her sat a woman Jake didn't recognize, wearing an expensive suit, and the kind of predatory smile that meant expensive legal trouble. "Mr. Morrison," Principal Davidson began, "this is Carol Westbrook from Child Protective Services. There's been a report filed regarding Emma's welfare." Jake felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" Carol Westbrook consulted her tablet with practiced efficiency. "We received an anonymous tip alleging that Emma is being neglected. Specifically, that she's been left alone for extended periods, and that she's been exhibiting signs of emotional distress consistent with an unstable home environment." "That's complete bullshit," Jake said, then immediately regretted the language in front of the principal. "I mean, those allegations are completely false." Emma was found crying in the bathroom during second period. Principal Davidson added gently, when asked what was wrong, she mentioned that someone was trying to make your family leave town. Jake looked at his daughter, seeing Sarah's stubborn streak in the set of Emma's jaw. "Em, what did you tell them?" "Just the truth," Emma said defiantly. "That crazy lady from the HOA is harassing us, that she's trying to steal our pool and make us move away." Carol Westbrook made a note. The reporting party mentioned that Emma has been overheard making threats against a neighbor, something about getting revenge on Mrs. Whitmore. Jake felt his temper spike. Margaret Whitmore filed this report, didn't she? The identity of reporting parties is confidential. Westbrook replied smoothly, but her expression confirmed Jake's suspicion. "This is harassment," Jake said. "Margaret Whitmore is using CPS as a weapon because I challenged her at the HOA meeting." "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're upset, but these are serious allegations that require investigation. I'll need to schedule a home visit within the next 48 hours. The drive home was silent, Emma staring out the window while Jake's mind raced through the implications. A CPS investigation would mean strangers crawling through his house, questioning his parenting, documenting every aspect of their private life. Even if he was clear-danned, he was confident the process would be humiliating and invasive. Worse, Margaret now knew exactly how to hurt him. Emma was his weak point, his only vulnerability in an otherwise defensible position. That evening, as Jake reviewed his security footage from the previous night, he caught a glimpse of Margaret's face, illuminated by his pool lights. She was kneeling by the water's edge, dumping something from a small container. Charles Whitmore. Again, she's lost her mind, Charles said, without preamble. The CPS report, the midnight visit sigh, can't stop her anymore. Then help me stop her. You don't understand. Margaret has files on everyone in this neighborhood. Financial records, personal information, secrets she's collected over the years. She's built a surveillance network that would make the NSA jealous. Jake thought about Margaret's knowledge of Sarah's death, information that hadn't been in any public records. What kind of secrets? Affairs, bankruptcies, tax problems, addiction issues, anything she can use as leverage. Harold Fitzpatrick votes with her because she knows about his gambling debts. Sarah Chen supports her because Margaret found out about her immigration status irregularities. Jesus Christ, Charles. How long has this been going on? Years. It started small, just keeping track of HOA violations and property values. But after she became president, it became an obsession. She has cameras hidden throughout the neighborhood, pays the landscaping crews to report on residents, even has access to some people's home security systems. A chill ran down Jake's spine. My security system. I don't know for sure, but Margaret has connections with several local installation companies. It's possible. Jake immediately began checking his system settings, looking for any unauthorized access or remote connections. What he found made his blood run cold. His cameras and sensors had been accessed 17 times in the past month, always between midnight and 4 a.m. Margaret hadn't just been visiting his backyard. She'd been watching his family sleep. The next morning brought another violation notice, this one for unapproved exterior modifications. Apparently, the fine was $1,200. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake. By accessing his security system remotely, she'd created a digital trail that Jake could follow. He spent the morning documenting the unauthorized access, taking screenshots, and saving log files. It wasn't enough to have her arrested yet, but it was a start. Emma found him at his computer when she got home from school. Any luck? Some. I can prove she's been hacking our security system and trespassing on our property. Good, because I have news too. Emma's expression was grim. I did some research on the Johnsons, the family that lost their house last year. Jake looked up from his laptop. What did you find? They didn't just lose their house because of HOA fines. She went after a grieving family. Dad, just like she's going after us. The parallel hit Jake like a physical blow. Margaret was drawn to vulnerable families, people dealing with loss and trauma who might be less likely to fight back. The Johnsons had been too devastated by their son's death to mount an effective defense. Margaret had seen Jake and Emma as similarly easy targets, a widower and his grieving daughter who just wanted to blend in and heal. She'd miscalculated. Can you promise me that? Emma nodded, but Jake could see the anger burning in her eyes. His daughter had inherited Sarah's protective instincts along with her delicate features, and Margaret's attack on their family had awakened something fierce in the teenager. That night, Jake installed additional security measures, cameras with local storage that couldn't be accessed remotely, motion sensors with silent alerts that would notify his phone without triggering audible alarms, and infrared illumination that would capture clear images even in complete darkness. If Margaret wanted to play surveillance games, Jake would make sure he had the better equipment. The CPS visit came on Thursday morning. Carol Westbrook arrived with a clipboard and the kind of aggressive professionalism that made Jake's skin crawl. She spent 2 hours going through his house, photographing everything from the contents of his refrigerator to Emma's bedroom, asking invasive questions about their daily routine. Part 3. The TRIP Jake spent the next week transforming his rage into meticulous planning. 20 years in construction had taught him that the difference between success and failure lay in the details. And Margaret Whitmore's midnight swimming sessions had given him all the details he needed. The modifications to his pool's heating system were elegant in their simplicity. Jake installed a secondary heating element connected to a motion sensor and timer system that would activate only between midnight and 4 a.m. When triggered, the system would rapidly heat the pool water to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause serious discomfort and minor burns, but not hot enough to cause permanent injury or death. The beauty of the system was its plausible deniability. If questioned, Jake could claim it was a malfunction in the new heating system, a simple thermostat failure that he was still working to debug. The motion sensors were concealed within existing pool equipment housing, and the timer was programmed to reset itself every morning, leaving no digital trail of intentional activation. But Jake's real masterstroke was the addition of thermal cameras and underwater recording equipment. When Margaret inevitably returned for another midnight swim, he would have crystal-clear documentation of her trespassing, her use of his property, and her reaction to the heated water. It would be evidence that no court could ignore, and ammunition that would destroy her credibility forever. Emma noticed her father's improved mood over the weekend. "You seem different," she observed Saturday morning as they ate breakfast by the pool, less stressed, just working through some problems. Jake replied, testing the water temperature with a digital thermometer. A perfect 78 degrees, comfortable for swimming, with no hint of the furnace it could become after dark. Problems involving Mrs. Whitmore. Jake looked at his daughter, weighing how much to tell her. Emma was smart enough to know he was planning something, but he didn't want her involved in what came next. "Let's just say I'm taking a more proactive approach to our neighborhood situation." Seeing through his careful explanations to the truth beneath, "Dad, whatever you're planning, just ... be careful, okay? That woman is crazy, and crazy people don't react rationally when they're cornered." Jake reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand. "I promise you, everything I'm doing is designed to protect our family. Margaret Whitmore has pushed this conflict way beyond reasonable boundaries, and it's time she faced some consequences." That afternoon, Charles Whitmore appeared at Jake's front door, looking more haggard than ever. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "We need to talk," Charles said, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward his own house. Jake led him to the backyard. Noting how Charles's gaze lingered on the pool equipment housing where Jake had concealed his new modifications. "Margaret's planning something," Charles said without preamble. "She's been making phone calls, researching legal precedents, talking to contractors about pool removal services. Let her research all she wants. I'm not backing down. You don't understand. She's not planning to make you remove the pool anymore. She's planning to have it condemned as a public health hazard. She's been collecting water samples during her ... visits, planning to introduce contaminants that would make the water unsafe, then call in health inspectors to shut it down permanently." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Margaret wasn't just trespassing, she was planning to sabotage his pool with dangerous chemicals, potentially creating a legitimate safety hazard that could justify her harassment campaign. What kind of contaminants? Charles pulled out his phone, showing Jake a series of text messages. She's been researching bacterial cultures, industrial chemicals, anything that would require expensive remediation or permanent closure. Jake read the messages with growing horror. Margaret had contacted multiple suppliers asking about availability of E. coli cultures, industrial solvents, and other substances that could make pool water genuinely dangerous. One message discussed the possibility of introducing chemicals that would be difficult to detect, but impossible to fully remove. Jesus Christ, Charles, she's talking about biological warfare. I tried to talk her out of it, but she's completely obsessed. She keeps saying that you forced her hand by organizing the neighbors against her authority. Jake thought about Emma swimming in contaminated water, about the potential health consequences of Margaret's planned sabotage. Tomorrow night, she's already acquired most of what she needs. Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Charles nodded, understanding passing between them. "Jake, whatever you're planning, please don't do anything that can't be undone." After Charles left, Jake spent the evening modifying his trap. The heated water was no longer enough. Margaret's planned escalation demanded a more severe response. He adjusted the system's maximum temperature to 140 degrees, hot enough to cause immediate pain and potential second-degree burns. It was a line he'd never imagined crossing. But Margaret's plan to contaminate his pool with dangerous chemicals had changed the rules of engagement. Emma or other neighborhood children who might access the pool. Jake told himself he was protecting his daughter, defending his property, stopping a dangerous criminal from carrying out a plan that could hurt innocent people. Jake spent Monday in a state of hyper-alertness, jumping at every phone ring, constantly checking his security monitors for signs of Margaret's approach. Emma noticed his tension but didn't comment. Jake positioned himself in his bedroom, with a clear view of the backyard security monitors. The thermal cameras showed the pool area in ghostly detail, every shadow and movement captured in stark relief. The water temperature held steady at 78 degrees, but Jake's finger hovered over the activation switch for the heating system. Margaret appeared at 12:47 a.m., moving. With the confidence of someone who believed she owned the night, she carried a small cooler and what looked like testing equipment. Watched her set up her materials by the pool's edge, his anger building as she laid out vials of unknown substances with scientific precision, his pool like a petri dish for whatever biological or chemical experiment she had planned. But then Margaret did something unexpected. Instead of immediately introducing contaminants into the water, she began to undress for her usual midnight swim. Jake realized with growing horror that Margaret planned to swim in the water before contaminating it, ensuring that any dangerous substances would be introduced after she'd finished her recreational use of his property. The casual narcissism of the assumption that she could use his pool for pleasure before destroying it pushed Jake's rage beyond any rational boundary. Finger found the activation switch. The heating system engaged with a soft hum. Jake watched the thermal display as the water temperature began to climb. 85 degrees, 95, 105. The system was designed to heat the water rapidly, using high-powered elements that could raise the temperature 20 degrees in less than 5 minutes. Margaret slipped into the water at 110 degrees. For a moment, she seemed confused rather than alarmed. The water was warmer than usual, but not yet hot enough to cause immediate pain. She floated on her back, arms spread wide, completely unaware that the temperature was continuing to climb. 115 degrees, 121 to 5. Jake watched Margaret's expression change from confusion to concern to growing alarm as the water around her began to feel uncomfortably warm. She tried to exit the pool, but the ladder rungs were now too hot to touch comfortably. 130 degrees. Margaret's calm midnight swim became frantic treading water as she realized something was seriously wrong. She called out not loudly enough. Margaret was now in genuine panic, her skin reddening from the heat as she desperately tried to find a way out of the increasingly scalding water. The pool deck was too high to climb out without using the ladder, and the metal handrails were now painfully hot to the touch. Jake's finger hesitated over the shutdown switch. He could stop the heating system now, before Margaret suffered serious injury, and he would have clear evidence of her planned sabotage. But then he thought about Emma crying in the principal's office, about the CPS investigation, about Margaret's plan to contaminate the pool with dangerous chem. Part 4. Aftermath. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Jake signed for the thick envelope with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago, though. The guilt still churned in his stomach every time he closed his eyes. Whitmore, 5. Morrison, $2.8 million in damages for gross negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and willful endangerment resulting in permanent disfigurement, and psychological trauma. Jake spread the legal documents across his kitchen table, Emma reading over his shoulder as they absorbed the magnitude of Margaret's counterattack. Even from her hospital bed, the woman was orchestrating a campaign designed to destroy them financially. $2.8 million. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, we don't have that kind of money." Jake studied the medical reports attached to the lawsuit. Margaret had suffered second- and third-degree burns over 32% of her body, requiring multiple skin grafts and reconstructive surgeries. The photographs of her injuries were horrific: angry, red welts and blistered skin that would scar permanently. Jake felt the familiar stab of guilt that had plagued him since that night. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, deliberately inflicting suffering on another human being. The fact that Margaret had been planning to contaminate his pool with dangerous chemicals didn't erase the brutality of, and felt his sympathy evaporate. Margaret wasn't just suing for medical expenses and pain and suffering. She was claiming that Jake had deliberately set a booby trap designed to injure anyone who entered his pool area, making his property a public menace. She was demanding that the pool be permanently filled in, and that he be banned from any future HOA involvement. Most audaciously, she was claiming that her midnight visits to Jake's property had been legitimate HOA inspections that she was legally entitled to conduct. She's really going to claim she was conducting official business at 1 in the morning? Emma asked, incredulous. Jake's lawyer, David Chun Mrs. Chun's nephew, and one of the few attorneys in town who wasn't intimidated by the Whitmore family's reputation, had warned him this was coming. Margaret's legal team is expensive and aggressive, David had explained during their meeting the previous week. They're going to paint you as a dangerous vigilante who set traps for innocent neighbors. The fact that Margaret was trespassing and planning vandalism will help our case, but her injuries are severe enough to generate sympathy from a jury. The local news had already picked up the story, though not in the way Jake had expected. The headline in the Oakwood Hills Gazette read, "Pool malfunction injures neighbor during late-night emergency," with Margaret quoted as saying she'd been checking on unusual noises from the Morrison property when the tragic equipment failure occurred. No mention of her planned contamination of the pool, no reference to her months of harassment, no discussion of her midnight trespassing or unauthorized use of his property. Margaret's version of events was already becoming the accepted narrative, painting her as a concerned neighbor who'd been victimized by Jake's negligent pool maintenance. "Mrs. Patterson wouldn't even make eye contact with me, and I heard Mr. Williams telling someone that maybe the HOA was right about our pool being dangerous." Jake felt the familiar rage building in his chest. Even after everything Margaret had done, even with evidence of her planned sabotage, she was still managing to control the narrative and turn the neighborhood against his family. That evening, Charles Whitmore appeared at Jake's door, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His usual nervous demeanor had been replaced by something approaching desperation. "I need to show you something," Charles said, glancing around nervously, "but not here. Can you meet me at Riverside Park in an hour?" Jake found Charles sitting alone on a bench overlooking the pond, clutching a manila folder like it contained the secrets of the universe. The older man's hands shook as he handed over the documents. "I thought you should see them before," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jake opened the folder and felt his blood run cold. She had financial records, medical information, employment histories, showing discrepancies that could lead to deportation. Harold Fitzpatrick's gambling debts and his daughter's drug treatment records, Sarah Williams's affair with her personal trainer, but the most disturbing section was labeled Morrison Family Priority Target and contained information that made Jake's stomach turn. Margaret had researched Sarah's death in exhaustive detail, private medical records that should have been confidential. Most chilling was Margaret's handwritten analysis of their family's psychological vulnerabilities and her strategy for accelerating their departure from the community. "She's been planning this for months," Jake said, his voice barely controlled. "The pool violation, the CPS report, everything. It was all part of a deliberate campaign to drive us out." Charles nodded miserably. "Margaret doesn't just want to control the neighborhood anymore, she wants to own it completely. Anyone who challenges her authority becomes a target for elimination." Jake studied the files, seeing the scope of Margaret's operation clearly for the first time. She hadn't just been harassing individual families, she'd been systematically collecting leverage on everyone, building a network of secrets and fears that gave her absolute power over the community. "Charles, why are you showing me this now?" The older man's face crumpled. "Because Margaret is planning to use these files in court. She's going to claim that you knew about her legitimate HOA duties and deliberately set a trap to injure a community official performing her legal responsibilities." Jake felt the walls closing in around him. Margaret was going to use her own criminal behavior, the surveillance, the harassment. Margaret's lawyers had been contacting other neighbors, blackmail. Margaret was blackmailing their neighbors into providing false testimony that would support her lawsuit. "You have to stop her, Charles. This is criminal behavior." With what evidence? Margaret claims these files were compiled through routine community research, and that sharing the information would be helping neighbors make informed decisions. Her lawyers have found ways to make everything technically legal. Jake stared at the files, understanding finally that he was fighting more than just a vindictive neighbor. Margaret Whitmore had built a criminal enterprise disguised as community service, using her position as HOA president to justify surveillance, harassment, and extortion. But she'd made one crucial mistake by suing him for $2.8 million. She'd opened herself up to discovery proceedings that could expose everything she'd been doing. "Charles, I need you to testify about these files, about Margaret's surveillance operation, her harassment campaign, everything you've told me." Charles shook his head frantically. "I can't." Jake understood Charles's fear, but he also knew that Margaret's power depended on her victim's silence. If one person stood up to her publicly, others might find the courage to follow. "What if I could guarantee your protection? What if I could make sure Margaret couldn't retaliate against you? How could you possibly do that?" Jake looked at the files again, seeing them not as weapons Margaret could use against the neighborhood, but as evidence of her criminal conspiracy. "Because I'm going to make sure these files become public record, all of them, every secret, every piece of blackmail material, everything she's collected." Charles stared at him in horror. "You can't do that. You'd destroy half the families in this neighborhood. Margaret already destroyed them. She just let them pretend they were still free." Jake closed the folder, his decision made. It's time. Everyone knew exactly what kind of monster they've been living with. The next morning, Jake called David Chen and laid out his new strategy. Instead of simply defending against Margaret's lawsuit, they would go on the offensive, filing countercharges for harassment, invasion of privacy, computer hacking, and conspiracy to commit fraud. More importantly, they would demand full discovery of Margaret's files and surveillance equipment, forcing her to reveal the extent of her operations in open court. "It's risky," David warned. "You'll be exposing your own family's private information, along with everyone else's. Are in."